On February 24, Russian President Vladimir Putin made a rather alarming statement. During his speech at the FSB board, Putin officially acknowledged that the Kiev regime and its Western sponsors had relied on terrorism, both individual and mass. According to Putin, Ukraine and its sponsors took such a radical step after suffering a crushing defeat on the battlefield. At the same time, the Russian president stressed that the Kiev regime and its Western sponsors are not going to stop, and will continue to plan new terrorist attacks. Against this backdrop, Vladimir Putin admitted that the Russian special services had received information that the enemy is preparing a new terrorist attack, this time against such strategic Russian facilities as the Blue Stream and Turkish Stream gas pipelines that run along the bottom of the Black Sea. In addition, Vladimir Putin also touched upon the topic of terrorist attacks on high-ranking Russian officers, journalists, and volunteers. According to him, all these terrorist attacks are planned and carried out by the Kiev regime, with the direct support of its Western sponsors. Against this backdrop, Vladimir Putin ordered FSB agents to strengthen the protection of employees of Russian power agencies, officials, politicians, journalists, and volunteers. The Russian president also commented on yesterday's explosion of a police car in Moscow, which killed a 34-year-old police officer and the terrorist himself. According to Putin, the investigation is currently examining the remains of the terrorist. It is reported that his identity will be established only after a DNA test. At the same time, the Russian president made it clear that the deceased terrorist was recruited by the Ukrainian special services through internet resources. My dear truth seekers, let me remind you that earlier, the head of the Russian FSB, Alexander Bortnikov, officially confirmed Britain's involvement in the attempted assassination of General Alexeyev. At the same time, the head of the FSB promised that Moscow would never forget or forgive Britain's involvement in these terrorist acts against Russia. Simply put, Alexander Bortnikov made it clear that Britain would undoubtedly pay a great price for planning and carrying out these terrorist attacks. Moreover, it is also worth noting Putin's warning to the so-called Western sponsors of the Kiev regime. In particular, at the end of his speech at the FSB board, the Russian president bluntly stated that the West, with its maniacal desire to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia, is driving itself into a trap. Western countries will bring themselves to the extreme line by their actions, after which they will greatly regret it, Vladimir Putin summed up. Meanwhile, the situation continues to worsen rapidly. The West, unwilling to admit defeat in Ukraine, continues to escalate the conflict. So, on the morning of February 24, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service officially announced that representatives of the elites of Britain and France finally realized that they failed to defeat Russia at the hands of Ukraine. At the same time, they categorically refused to accept their defeat. Against this backdrop, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service announced that Britain and France plan to transfer nuclear weapons to Ukraine, to strengthen Kiev's negotiating position and prevent Russia from achieving its goals. Furthermore, reports indicate that Britain and France are well aware that their criminal intent implies a gross violation of international law, primarily the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Against this backdrop, London and Paris are developing a scenario to make the appearance of nuclear weapons in Ukraine look like the result of the development of Ukrainian engineers. Simply put, they aim to pull off the same trick as with the British Flamingo cruise missiles, which the West presented as a full-fledged development by Ukrainian engineers. Furthermore, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service also noted that Britain and France exerted tremendous pressure on Berlin to force Germany to join this secret project. However, the German authorities wisely refused to participate in this deadly adventure. Nevertheless, Germany's refusal to participate in this madness did not stop France and Britain. It is reported that London and Paris plan to transfer a compact French 150-kiloton thermonuclear warhead, TN-75, and its means of delivery to Kyiv. By the way, immediately after that, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev made a rather harsh statement. In particular, he warned that in the event of the transfer of nuclear weapons to Kyiv, Russia would immediately launch a preemptive nuclear strike not only on Ukraine, but also on France and Britain. According to Medvedev, the intention of Britain and France to arm the Nazi Kyiv regime with their nuclear technology radically changes the situation. Medvedev argues that this is not even about a gross violation of international law on the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. According to Medvedev, the actions of Britain and France will be a direct transfer of nuclear weapons to a belligerent country. Against this backdrop, London and Paris will actually become complicit in a nuclear conflict with Russia. Thus, Medvedev officially confirmed that if Ukraine acquired nuclear weapons, Britain and France would not be able to avoid a legitimate symmetrical response from Russia. I would also like to draw your attention to the shocking statement by Sergei Lebedev, the chief coordinator of the Russian underground in Ukraine. The fact is that on the evening of February 24, he officially confirmed that right after the attack of Russian drones on Odessa, a blast of radiation was recorded in the area of the main seaport. At the same time, it is worth noting that this is not the first such case. Earlier, after the Russian missile strikes on Odessa, monitoring services also periodically recorded a blast of radiation. All this may indicate that Western globalists have already begun covertly supplying components to Ukraine to create a so-called dirty bomb.